The signs of worm infection in cattle often go unnoticed until the problem becomes severe. By that time, producers are frequently experiencing significant unseen losses in productivity. Gastrointestinal nematodes live in the abomasum, which is the fourth stomach, as well as the intestines, and they cause sickness and death, as well as reducing appetite, feed intake and productivity. Young stock and pregnant animals are most at risk. That's because of their weaker immune system and low resilience to the worms. Appetite and feed intake can be affected significantly, more than 10 to 20%, even when the animal has a low worm burden. Knowing your worm infection level and administering the appropriate treatment reduces losses and prevents further worm egg contamination of paddocks, which may lead to further worm problems down the track. Fecal egg counts are essential in determining the level of adult internal parasite burden and providing valuable information to influence the drenching decision. Fecal egg counts are a practical and accurate tool to estimate the burden of adult worms in monitored animals, or to check the overall worm status of a mob or group to decide if a therapeutic treatment is necessary. That is, a treatment that will directly benefit the animals treated. They're a lot more accurate than trying to do a visual assessment, and they'll identify an emerging problem long before any visual signs appear, at which time significant production losses will already be occurring. The ideal timing to conduct a fecal egg count depends on the individual situation, but working on the following can assist you. Do a fecal egg count 7 to 10 days prior to a planned activity such as joining or weaning. 30 days after a seasonal break allows time for the worm eggs to hatch on the pasture, infect the livestock and be detectable in a fecal egg count. Monitoring during high-risk periods is recommended because livestock in high condition scores can also have a high worm infestation that's causing production losses and can rapidly escalate, resulting in poor health. To check the effectiveness of a drench, conducting a fecal egg count on the day of treatment and again 14 days after drenching will determine the drench's efficacy and inform you of any emerging resistance to those active ingredients. Long-acting drench best practice should require a 30, 60 and 90-day fecal egg count to monitor for resistant worms and determine your requirements of an exit, also known as a clearance or a tail cutter drench. The most important worms in Australian cattle are first of all small brown stomach worm, which we call Osteotargia osteitargi. This one lives in the abomasum or fourth stomach. It prefers cooler, high rainfall areas, but it can hibernate during the hotter months in the stomach wall lining, and then it emerges in a mass when the weather is more favourable in autumn or after a break in the weather. This is known as type 2 infection. The small brown stomach worm is common in the temperate areas of southern Australia. The females lay about 100 eggs per day. The second one is stomach hairworm, also known as Trichostrongylus axii. This one lives in the abomasum. It generally causes a lot of irritation within the fourth stomach, and it's common across all of Australia. Females lay about 100 to 200 eggs per day. The next one is the small intestinal worm, also known as Cuperia. There's several species of this and they're very common across all of Australia. They live in the small intestine. Now this one exacerbates the losses when it's present with other worms because it interferes with nutrient absorption. Cuperia on their own can cause death in calves in high numbers. The females lay about 200 eggs per day. The next one is Barber's pole worm. In cattle, this one's called Haemonchus placei. It lives in the abomasum or fourth stomach. It really likes warm, moist conditions, so it's very common in the northern areas, but it's increasingly found in southern regions, especially in times of summer rainfall. It's got a tooth and it sucks blood. The females lay 5,000 to 10,000 eggs per day. Please visit Worm Tracks as part of the Livestock Solutions on the Zoetis website for further information. The number of worms in the cattle's stomach and intestines is strongly correlated with the number of eggs seen in the faeces. Therefore, counting the eggs in dung samples is a simple and non-invasive way of monitoring worm burdens in cattle. The higher the number of samples taken, the better indication of the worm burden in the whole mob. Studies have shown that 15 samples will usually correctly reflect the status of a mob of about 200 head, but accuracy decreases as mob size increases. You should have a collection tray provided by the company who's undertaking the fecal egg count test, or for a temporary solution, resealable plastic bags can be adequate until you have your sampling kit. One method of collecting the fecal matter is directly from the rectum of the individual animal. Alternatively, samples can be obtained from the field, as in picked up from the cow pats, after holding the mob for around 15 minutes in a corner. Ensure the fecal sample is clean from foreign material, it's fresh, like as in warm, still steaming, and each sample is from a unique animal. It's important that the sampling kit is correctly sealed and all paperwork is filled out correctly. You need to send the fecal samples off as quickly as possible and within 2 days of the sample date. If short-term storage is required, place the sealed samples in a cool place, not the fridge, out of light for no longer than 48 hours before sending away to the laboratory. Once the fecal sample is received by the laboratory, you should receive the fecal egg count data back within about 24-48 hours. The level of worm egg counts determines the risk of production losses and/or death. The significance of the number of eggs is determined by the species of worm present. To do this requires a larval culture. When you receive your fecal egg count report, you'll see a variation in the egg count between different animals in the same mob. This can be due to different health statuses of the animals. For example, one animal might be ill or have an overtaxed immune system and be more vulnerable to internal and external parasites. The age of the animal is a big factor, and younger animals are more susceptible to worms. Towards the end of joining, bulls are more susceptible to worms. Pregnant and lactating animals will likely have a higher worm burden, and each individual animal genetically has a different tolerance to worms and will have different fecal egg count levels. Most of the significant worm species have eggs that appear similar or almost exactly the same during a worm egg count, so larval culture is required to identify the species present in the sample. This adds further value to the test result. You need a minimum of about 100 eggs per gram to undertake a reliable larval culture. A mixed worm infection is more severe and more common than a monoculture of a single worm species. Larval culture involves incubating the worm eggs in the lab for 7 days under specific conditions of temperature and humidity to allow the larvae to hatch and develop to the 3rd stage. The 3rd stage larvae are stained and examined under a microscope to work out the species of worms present in the sample. Species can also be determined by doing a polymerase chain reaction test. From this accurate data of overall worm egg numbers, the variation of worm egg numbers between individuals, and the identification of the worm species present, a reliable drench solution can be recommended by your animal health consultant. One of the primary pillars of a high-performing herd is to limit the productivity and financial impact of the intestinal worms. To be able to make an informed decision on drenching your livestock, have the accurate data of a fecal egg count and larval culture. It's an essential activity. Thank you very much for watching. I trust you found this informative. If you have any questions, please visit Livestock Solutions on the Zoetis website for further information.